thanks for having me. Actually saw some familiar faces I haven't seen since pre-COVID or before, so nice to do that on a social level as well. Lucas and the team asked me to talk today about channel diversification, which in my judgment, and I will say out front for the group's benefit, I'm not a marketer by background. I'm a founder with some other experiences I'll share with you. But for me, that means taking very scarce resources that your company has against an unlimited and growing set of places you can put those resources to get your brand out there and to acquire customers, and assessing what to do with that concoction. So I'm going to talk to you today based on some specific anecdotes I've had in my own career working as a founder and with peers in the space, and hopefully that'll be interesting and informative. My name's Jono. My career started in a cubicle at Morgan Stanley, which was quite painful. I left in 2009 and transitioned into a venture studio, which I put together with some other folks called Launch. In 8 years, we built 6 venture-backed companies in the digital native brand space, some marketplaces, some retail enablement tech. And in 2021, I had Ari. We all transitioned out of Launch, and just last year, I launched a company called InHouse that I'll tell you more about, which is a marketplace serving the short-term rental space. So, talking about channel diversification, my broad observation has been that sort of gravity and linear thinking pulls us away from channels with friction. And the way that I conceptualize this is, I've sat around tables discussing sort of marketing and with marketers, and generally we go through something resembling this 5-point checklist. Channels that are appropriate and investable for us tend to be things that are measurable. If I don't trust the attribution mechanism, it's difficult to make investments there. It's safe for our brand, so our brand is sacred, and we have to be very careful about putting the brand out there in channels and places where we don't want to be seen. It has to be maybe not cheap, but it has to be affordable, or else, of course, there's no point in talking about a given channel. It has to be simple to the extent that the channel or the approach that we choose isn't a distraction from other priorities that we all have, particularly in younger businesses. And it has to be scalable, because if it's not scalable, who cares, right? And the thing that I've sort of observed here is that when you follow a framework like that, it tends to lead you to places that are lower friction, right? So you look for these 5 factors or some version of them to come together, and you determine that things that don't satisfy those factors are too hard. So if you can't measure it, it's not safe for your brand, you can't afford it, or any of these combinations, you tend to migrate away from it. And at some point, I think down in this end of the spectrum, as brand owners or founders, you get into a place of optimization, and some very interesting conversations from my colleagues tonight about what happens when you get to a place where a channel is quite mature and quite distributed, like, for the most obvious example, the sort of meta channels. You get to a place where experts with high data signal, et cetera, can help you optimize those. But this middle comfort zone, where we feel like we're getting something that is viable but not yet overly mature, is where a lot of dollars seem to go, and a lot of people feel like they're making a sensible, good choice. My thesis and framework, which I'll offer you to be a bit provocative, would be that if you're actually leaning into friction when you're choosing channels to approach, there's a high probability you're doing something right. And I'll offer a few anecdotal examples of, again, entrepreneurs and other folks who built great companies or accomplished marketing goals by leaning into friction where it looked like you should be steering away. So I'm going to start with this guy right here, who is both a client of Darkroom and a longtime collaborator of mine named Eric Gerard. In 2019, he came to me and my teammates and said he wanted to build a new steel-toed boot business that later became known as BRUNT. And we said, okay, sounds good, you know, pretty crowded space. Figs was in market and lots of activity already with Tecovas and the workwear space generally. But we said, fine. And he said, and here's how I want to launch it. I'm going to do a podcast. And we're not going to talk about Brunt or our boots at all. We're going to sit on buckets turned upside down. And I'm going to bring on a part-time mechanic and guests every single session. And we're going to kind of talk about the trades and our side hustles and what we think about being blue collar and trade workers in the world. And I said, well, I got to be honest, Eric, that doesn't meet a lot of our criteria around friction. For example, there are 1.2 million podcasts already in the ecosystem. It seems highly unlikely you're going to find this to be a scalable approach. If you do get customers, how are we going to measure them and attribute them? I've just learned that maybe we don't have to. And I'm not sure. I don't know your brand yet, but it seems like it's kind of risky to do this. I don't know that this cohort's even going to be interested in podcasts. Eric said, thank you very much for your input. I'll be doing this anyway. And 3 years later, he's running a $100 million run rate company in Brunt. They've done 65 podcasts or so, and they're a top 2% podcast in the world. But a lot of the things that we said here were actually true from a friction standpoint. So he never reached that many people with the podcast to matter to his growth goals. And it was hard to attribute even if he had done that. The interesting thing was one of his guests on the podcast ended up being the owner of an extremely influential construction business. And another one of them, and he wanted his son to have an internship at Brunt. And another one ended up being someone who joined their team full time. And so my learning from Eric's work there was, you may think that you understand how to diagnose some of these factors, but oftentimes it's the second order effects that come out of doing something authentic like this that end up delivering on all the metrics and more that you hope for from a sort of lower friction undertaking. One more from Eric, since he deserves it. He came to me the next year before Brunt was really on its way, and he said, "I've got an idea." And he texted me a picture of a NASCAR that they were going to sponsor. And I said, "I don't know a lot about NASCAR. I grew up in the Upper East Side of New York. We don't do a lot of that kind of thing here. But it sounds brand right, Eric. But it sounds wallet wrong." And I think, not having learned my lesson out of hand, sort of dismissed that. And I said, you're never going to be able to do that. I looked it up today. It costs $10 to $20 million to full wrap a NASCAR. And 2 months later, Eric invited me to their tailgate at New Hampshire Motor Speedway to watch the Brunt car, drive. And I was there with my wife, and we watched the first lap of the Brunt car go around, and then she wanted to, get a drink or something. By the time I came back, I couldn't find the Brunt car. And I kept waiting, and I was like, what happened? What happened here? And it turned out that one lap into the race, the car crashed. But Eric, in the process, got really good pictures, and everyone who was wondering how serious his company was saw that Brunt was sponsoring a NASCAR, and instead of taking the pains of being the NASCAR that crashed on the first lap, he spun it into an underdog story. And he said, Brunt supports underdogs. We're underdogs against Red Wing and Carhartt in the boot business, and wouldn't you like to come join us in that journey? And years later, he's gone back. He's become a permanent sponsor of the Brunt NASCAR. He sponsors professional bull riding right next to Yeti, and he also sponsors professional cornhole, which I didn't realize was a sport. So really interesting guy I've learned a ton from. This is a story about Belly Welly and Facebook community acquisition, which unto its, on face value would seem like was not something I even knew was a possibility. So I called up a friend about a year ago, and I told him I was trying to sponsor some Facebook groups, and they had a lot of anti-solicitation and anti-promo rules, and I just couldn't figure out how to either message people behind the scene or pay enough pay enough to get our, our posts sort of featured there. And I basically concluded that as far as we were concerned, even highly active, authentic Facebook communities were too complex to circumvent, and they were going to be too expensive to post at a cadence that would ever deliver ROI. And he goes, why are you posting there? Why are you messaging people? Just buy the community. And he told me the story of Belly Welly, which is a gut health snacks company, which, as I understand, went and found some of the most important gut health Facebook groups, and rather than sponsor them or try to message and sort of circumvent the system, they actually went out and bought these groups and maintained a level of authenticity, but also started to spread their own message through super advocates of gut health. So my lesson from this woman, Katie, who I don't actually know, was oftentimes you can find channels that aren't for sale. Buy things that aren't for sale, make them happen, and friction that you thought existed turns out to be just a reason for a lower purchase price. We've obviously seen this play out in lots of other formats, early, social handle exchanges and things like that. But I thought that was an interesting lesson. I worked for a while with a woman named Esther Park at one of our companies, Rockets of Awesome. She is an incredible product leader and has since become a founder in the organic baby formula space. And she explained to me one day that she would be launching a new kind of baby formula. And I said, Esther, that sounds hard. I think it's like the kind of thing that would be quite regulated. And she goes, oh yeah, we raised a little bit of money, but it's going to take us like 3 to 5 years to get to market. And my radar went off, and I said, that sounds awfully expensive and awfully complex to do. And even once you get there, no one's heard of your product, and aren't they going to be inclined to buy the Similac formula that they grew up on or felt was safe? And what I didn't know was happening was that behind the scenes, Esther had been incubating simultaneously another product solution for her customers called Nara Baby, which is a breastfeeding tracker, and she was able to build what ended up being the #1 for a period of time breastfeeding tracker in the App Store. And the thing that I thought was super interesting there is sometimes when you have an ultra complex channel and the friction's very high because it seems impossible to overcome, you can disaggregate some of those complexities, break them off into individual pieces, first solve the, first get to know your customer, get your name out there. She now has 100,000 or more parents who know Nara and are excited to trust her down through the next step of her process. So rather than biting it all up at once, you can do that. Just 1 or 2 more examples. After launch and after Ari, as I mentioned, I ended up building a company called InHouse. And the inspiration for InHouse, we had been running a company called Trade Coffee, which is one of the largest specialty coffee marketplaces in the world. And when 2020 rolled around, a bunch of our customers started to spend much more time at Airbnbs. And we started to see coming through our funnel these very large orders that looked like offices, but we knew no one was in the office in 2020. And I said, what the heck is going on? Like, are these work from home stipends? What's happening with these orders that don't look like any other order we've ever had? And it turned out that with the Airbnb boom, hosts were starting to buy coffee as an amenity for their guests on stay. And about 4 weeks after we saw these spikes in orders by the hosts, we started to see post-purchase surveys come through saying that guests who were new subscribers to Trade Coffee actually had found us in the context of their Airbnb stay. And I looked at that together and I said, wow, we got to scale this up with Trade Coffee. We can do this. There are 2 million Airbnbs in America. Let's go for it. And we started to try and do it, and it was absolutely impossible. There was no way to get the contact information for the hosts. There was no way to get in front of them. Airbnb wouldn't work with us. And so what I ended up doing was building a new company called InHouse, which literally does this for a living. And what we do is we help the host side of the equation We let hosts access a catalog of several 100,000 SKUs that they can buy at deep discounts for their properties. And then we activate an in-home commerce experience for guests to buy the products that they experienced on stay while they're in the geographic radius of that home for deep discounts. And it's an acquisition tool for the brand. So for me personally, this was an interesting case where the scalability and complexity led me to say, hey, maybe this is a channel that should exist that doesn't exist. And sometimes there may be channel opportunities in addition to channel distribution opportunities in some of this friction. This one's more of a throwaway, but again, growing up, this is what I saw in subway ads in New York. It was either a fortune teller or a attorney. And the interesting thing is now when you go into the subway, the only thing you see is the most sort of modern, distributed, forward-thinking technology brands and consumer brands that you could imagine. And as crazy as it sounds, because now we're all very comfortable with the idea that this is where great brands live, there was a time when the brand risk friction of the subway was so high that nobody would do it. The inventory was cheaper, and yet no one was doing it. So my takeaway from there is sometimes it's helpful to look in plain sight for things that just seem off that might in fact be on. Another quick observation before I wrap up, sometimes in addition to the first sort of primary benefits of going into some of these higher friction channels than you might be inclined to, is that there are these second order effects. So one thing, from Eric's example and otherwise, and from Esther's, you get really close to the customer when you're in high friction channels. You can't step away from them in the way that you can with automated, more mature markets in many cases, and that ends up leading to a lot of incremental customer listening and learning. Team members tend to like to be part of companies that are operating in some of these kinds of channels. So of course, end of the day, we're all solving for ROI and bottom line, but I've been amazed by how important it is for some of our team members to want to be part of pioneering sort of approaches. And finally, like I mentioned with the internship, sometimes there's magic or serendipity that comes out of doing things that are hard in this regard. And I wouldn't underestimate the fact that just because you can't measure it or in advance determine what it might be, that it isn't valuable. I felt it was inappropriate not to at least offer up, an answer to where is good friction today. Honestly, I'm not sure, but I will say that I am quite sure that it exists somewhere at the intersection of all the reasons why not to participate in a given space. So, there are unadulterated channels. GPT currently is a solution, or the tools that come out of it. It is a space being used for productivity. One day it's going to be polluted in the way that all other high velocity channels are. Today it's not, so what does that mean for us? The Vision Pro is an unproven ecosystem. Scott Galloway says it's not going to work. Kara Swisher says it does. What's the right answer? Mashups. So, mashups these are some modern versions perhaps of brand risk. Canal putting your product onto another company's site and treating it like a marketplace distribution or disco. And then also finally, what's old is new. I would say that this is a dirty word right now to be talking about Web3 for most people. It's probably exactly the time that there's really interesting stuff going on there. And then finally, there's a limit because friction can sometimes go too far. Probably a lot of validity in a company like Wrappable that helps you get paid to wrap your car. Probably less so in Old Bay when they invite you to get paid to tattoo Old Bay seasoning on your calf. Thanks.